Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're undertaking a strictly clinical, serious investigation into the neuroscience of prescription stimulants. We're looking directly at the biological realities of how these compounds alter the human brain, separating the actual medical science from the popular myths of cognitive enhancement.
You think these little pills are making you smarter, but chemically they are just running a high-stakes dopamine overdraft on your brain's future energy. That is the biological reality. When misused, these medications do not create new energy, right? They borrow it from tomorrow, and they do it at an incredibly steep physiological interest rate. So we're going to map out exactly how this physiological debt is incurred, step by step.
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. Adderall versus Ritalin. The pharmacological divide.
Zooming all the way down to the microscopic synaptic level, both of these drug classes actually achieve the exact same ultimate goal. They both raise synaptic levels of dopamine and norepinephrine, but they use vastly different molecular mechanisms to get there. Methylphenidate, which you probably know as Ritalin, operates primarily as a reuptake inhibitor. It binds to the dopamine and norepinephrine transporters known as DAT and NET and simply blocks them. Think of it like putting a stopper in a sink drain. The neurotransmitters that were already naturally flowing just stay in the basin longer. Now, amphetamine found in Adderall does that too, but then it goes a massive step further. It doesn't just block the drain, it actively forces the system to release more.
Let me tell you exactly how aggressive amphetamine's multi-step mechanism really is. First, it actually enters the presynaptic neuron through those very same DAT and NET transporters. Once it's inside, it targets something called VMAT2. These are essentially the storage tanks for your brain's dopamine. Amphetamine acts like a molecular baseball bat taken to a pinata. It disrupts them and causes them to dump their dopamine directly into the cell's cytoplasm. Finally, because there's now so much dopamine inside the cell, it actually reverses the function of the DAT and NET transporters. So instead of pulling neurotransmitters out of the synapse, they become active pumps expelling huge amounts of dopamine and norepinephrine out into the cleft, regardless of whether the neuron was naturally firing or not. It's essentially ripping the drain out and opening the spigot wide open.
And this brilliantly illustrates how amphetamines physically reverse that transport function. It's not just a blockade like we see with methylphenidate, it's an active, forced evacuation of the cell's neurotransmitter reserves.
Moving on to Section 2. Reaching the chemical baseline, the baseline paradox.
So, you might be wondering, how do these exact same chemical mechanisms create completely different behavioral outcomes depending on the brain's starting state? Well, walking through the clinical data presents a really clear picture. In an ADHD brain, which neuroimaging suggests has anatomical alterations that effectively decrease dopaminergic function, taking these stimulants is kind of like filling a pothole. It increases deficient dopamine and norepinephrine up to a normal baseline. It actually inhibits the motor cortex, reducing hyperactivity and improves focus. The chemical loan balances their biological accounts. But in a healthy brain, one that already has normal dopamine regulation, taking these drugs creates a massive, completely unneeded dopamine surplus. This throws the brain into a state of severe hyperstimulation, resulting in immediate and profound biological debt.
This finding from the clinical comparisons highlights a crucial reality. For a non-ADHD individual, because amphetamines force that active release, the resulting excess synaptic dopamine creates an intense, unnatural euphoria. The brain is literally flooded. And it's precisely this unnatural high that drives the vicious cycle of recreational abuse among people just looking for a study aid or a quick energy boost.
Which brings us to Section 3, the price of abuse, the neurological cost.
That unnatural high definitely does not come for free. When the brain is repeatedly flooded with superphysiological levels of dopamine from stimulant abuse, it has to defend itself. It initiates a process called downregulation. This is a protective neurological mechanism where the brain actively reduces the number and the sensitivity of its postsynaptic dopamine receptors, specifically the D2 and D3 receptors. It is the brain's desperate attempt to protect itself from toxic levels of stimulation by literally dismantling its own reward architecture.
Now, what's really interesting about this data is the sheer magnitude of the changes. These effect sizes come directly from a comprehensive review in the JAMA network that compared hundreds of stimulant users to healthy controls. Just look at these massive negative effect sizes. Dopamine release is down by -0.84.
Dopamine transporter availability is down by negative 0.91, and D2/D3 receptor availability is down by negative 0.76. This isn't just some minor day-to-day fluctuation. This is systemic, measurable downregulation of both the presynaptic and postsynaptic aspects of the brain's entire dopamine system.
To put this structural change into perspective, research on primates given clinical human doses of amphetamines showed a staggering 30 to 50% decrease in striatal dopamine. The oxidative stress generated by this excess dopamine literally damages dopamine nerve terminals.
The physical and psychiatric tolls of borrowing this energy from tomorrow are just brutal. Systemically, abusers face VMAT2 depletion, which means they're effectively running out of their own stored dopamine. We see prefrontal cortex suppression, leading to severe deficits in impulse control and decision-making. Psychologically, this can manifest as severe anxiety, panic attacks, paranoia, and even full-blown psychosis. And cardiovascularly, these sympathomimetic drugs force the resting heart rate up by an average of 2 to 6 beats per minute and increase systolic blood pressure by 2 to 4 millimeters of mercury. Over time, that significantly raises the risk of long-term cardiovascular strain.
Section 4. The cognitive crash when the loan comes due.
I want you to really think about this for a second. What happens when the artificial dopamine rush ends and the inevitable cognitive crash sets in?
The clinical answer? Anhedonia. This is a profound, crushing inability to feel pleasure. Because the user's brain has downregulated its own receptors to survive the drug, and because it has entirely depleted its VMAT2 reserves, normal everyday activities, like eating a good meal, seeing your friends, or pursuing hobbies, simply cannot generate a sufficient dopamine signal anymore. The brain's volume is turned all the way down, resulting in extreme fatigue, a total lack of motivation, and deep depression.
Let's see how this builds, because healing from this overdraft is certainly not a quick process. It builds across a grueling timeline of recovery. Day 1 begins with acute withdrawal, that intense fatigue and anhedonia we just talked about. Over the following weeks and months, the prefrontal cortex remains suppressed, meaning the individual often really struggles with impulsivity and emotional dysregulation. According to neuroimaging research published in the Journal of Neuroscience, it takes a grueling 12 to 18 months of sustained abstinence for the brain's dopamine transporters to physically regrow and recover to near normal levels. Let that sink in. It takes up to a year and a half for the brain to truly clear the debt.
So the next time you hear someone refer to these medications as limitless pills, ask yourself, are they really gaining free cognitive energy, or are they just borrowing it from tomorrow at a devastating biological interest rate? Understanding the underlying mechanics of these compounds is the absolute first step to making informed decisions about our own neurobiology. Protect your brain and maximize your potential. Subscribe to our channel for more real science.